Well, as some of you know, I was raised in a pretty conservative, pretty traditional religious tradition. I grew up going to church. My parents took me to church every week, and I had just been on a very typical pathway of going to church, and it was just a part of my life, but it never really connected with me internally. And I went all through my life, all through my childhood, all through high school and college, all through the beginning part of when I was already married and actually had a child, where I went through the motions of going to church, but it wasn't really an experience for me. I didn't really know who Jesus was. And one day I was invited to a church when we were living in Central Florida. And the pastor, the man who became the pastor of that church, invested in my life. He took time to invest in me. He took time to share things with me and opened up my eyes to a world beyond the religious tradition that I grew up in, and to thought and to thinking and to just a different picture of who Jesus really was, different from what I had grown up with. Now, let me say that, first of all, I am not faulting anybody in my childhood, anybody who tried, because I know there were people in my life who did their best to try to give me a picture of Jesus. And it was probably all me and my stubbornness that just didn't get that picture. But it wasn't until this man took me under his wing and began to invest in me that my eyes just started to open up and I could see who Jesus really was. And because of him and because of the way that he invested in my life and the way that he inspired me, the way that he selflessly took time to spend with me and to invest in my growth and in my knowledge and understanding and then in my relationship with Jesus, I am who I am and where I am today. In fact, at the time that we met, I wasn't even in ministry. I was out in the marketplace. I was running my own business. But because of him, I saw not just the gift that God had placed in me, but I saw the potential of how I could take that gift and use it really to find and fulfill God's purpose in my life. And many of you who are watching us online, many of you who are here with us live today, you are here today because of the time and the passion that person invested in me. He is the reason that many of you are here, that many of you are taking the time out of your day to spend time with me. And I am so grateful for that. And whether he realizes it or not, he left a mark on my life. And many of you who are here today are a legacy of what he did to invest in me and my life. You know, we all want to leave our mark on the world. We all want to leave a legacy. We all have something inside us that inspires us to want to change the world. And the thing that we often miss, but I think if we really think about it, we understand, is that God is looking for people who will join him in changing the world. He's looking for people to join in what he is doing to make a difference in the world. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who was one of the rock stars of the early church, the man who wrote most of what we call today the New Testament, he would write this in a letter to the church in the ancient city of Ephesus. He would say, he creates each of us. He's talking about God the Father. He's saying he creates each of us by Christ Jesus to join him in the work he does. The good work he has gotten ready for us to do. And listen to this, work we had better be doing. It's work that we were created to do. It's work that he's gotten ready for us to do. And it's work that we need to be out there doing. Because here's the thing. God made you and me to change the world. And I'm not talking about just the earth. I'm not talking about like the entire globe world. I'm talking about God created you to make a difference, to change your world. He created you to change your world. The world you live in, the world you work in, the world you go to school in, at your job, in your classroom, in your neighborhood, the world that includes your family, the world that includes your friends. That's your world. And that's the world that God has placed you in. And that's the world that God created you to make a difference in. It's why he put you there. And so the question for us is, if we want to change the world, and if we can change the world, and if God created us and called us to change our world, then why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we out there changing the world? What is stopping us from doing it? Well, I believe that there are three things that keep us from changing the world. The first of those things is our own agenda. Our own agenda. And our own agenda comes in two forms. The first one is kind of a passive way that it's our own agenda. Because you know what? Life comes at you fast. I mean, it's from the commercial, but you've heard me say it many, many times because it's true. Especially if you live in a place like we live here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the pace of life is so quick and there's so many things to do and so many things to see and so many places to eat that life just comes at you. And if you are not deliberate about how you spend your time, you can just get caught up in the flow of doing the things that come at you and not really doing the things that you're intended to do that fulfill your purpose. But also when we talk about our own agenda, we're also talking about our plans for our life, the things that we want to accomplish, the things that we say to ourselves, this is what I want to do, this is who I want to be. And listen, there is nothing wrong with that. God created you to want those things. But the challenge for us is to see how our agenda and our plans fit into God's purpose for our life. Another thing that keeps us from changing the world is our unfulfilled potential. The same Apostle Paul wrote this in his letter to the church in Rome. He said, in his grace, God has given us, listen to this, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. See, Paul is reminding us that God gave each one of us a gift. God gave you a gift. He gave us all gifts, and he gave us all different gifts, right? Paul was very careful to make sure that we understand we all get different gifts. And the reason we have different gifts is because we all have different needs. Here's the thing. Your gift will almost never be what matches your needs. Listen to that again. Your gift will almost never be what matches your needs. Now, I know that's frustrating because it would only make sense that God would give me a gift that matches my needs. But you see, when God gives us a gift, that gift isn't designed for us to use on ourselves. That gift is designed for us to use on other people. God designed our gift to benefit other people, and God designed other people with gifts to benefit us. Now, here's the other thing. I might have said that. This might be the other thing. But here's the other thing. When God gave you your gift, He didn't give it to you fully developed. He gave it to you in a very raw, very unshaped form. He gave you the raw material, and then it's up to you to develop it. It's up to you to take the time to develop that gift into its fully developed form. Do you know what you call, or what we're going to call, the gap between the raw material that God gives us and the fully developed gift in its fully developed form? Do you know what we call that gap in between? We call that potential. We call that potential. And when we have our raw gift and we don't do anything to get it to its fully developed form, then what we have is unfilled potential. Now, the third thing that keeps us from changing the world is giants. Now, I'm not talking about these giants, and I'm definitely not talking about these giants, but I'm not talking about this guy either. A giant is anything that makes you feel like you just can't win. There are lots of different giants. A failing business, an impending divorce, your financial situation. Cancer could be a giant. Anything that makes you feel like the odds are stacked against you, those are the giants in your life. And listen, I know that there are some of you out there who want to make a difference in your world. You want to change your world. And you know that God has gifted you and has called you and created you to change your world. But there is a giant standing in your way, and it is keeping you from moving forward. And you'll either choose to face your giant or you'll run from it. And so today we're starting a 7-week series where we're going to take a deep dive into the life of the most famous giant killer of all time. One of the most famous kings of ancient Israel, a man named David. And if you've been hanging with us, you know that we just came out of talking about David as the Good Shepherd. And so today we're starting this new series. And here are the titles. I want to give them to you in advance. We're going to put them up here on the screen so that you can see how to find and fulfill your potential. What to do when winning costs you everything. What to do when you're running on empty. How to set the right priorities. How to recover from your worst mistake. Where you get your real strength from. How to finish your life well. Now listen, do yourself a favor and do your best to not miss any of these messages. And if you do happen to miss a week, then try as hard as you can to catch up on that week before the next week's message, because they all build on each other. And listen, if you have a friend who needs some encouragement, if you have a friend who feels like they're a little bit lost, then this is a great series for you to invite them to invite them to come and sit with you for one or more of these weeks, because this has the potential to change your life and to change their life. So let me tell you where we are in the story. It's been about 400 years since Moses and the Exodus. Now, if you don't know the story of Moses and Exodus, I would recommend that you watch the 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston will always be Moses to me. Actually, you're probably better off reading about the story in the book of Exodus in Scripture, but I just love the 10 Commandments, and so I tell people to go watch it whenever I can. They have it in color now too, so that's a great thing, right? But it's been 400 years since that happened, and Israel is now a nation, and Israel is a theocracy, which means God is the king, and God chooses leaders among the people to be his spokesman. So God chose Moses, and then God chose Joshua, and then he chose a series of different people that they called judges, and the last judge was a man named Samuel. Now Israel, by the time Samuel comes, and if we look at the whole history of Israel, Israel acts like an 8-year-old kid, right? Israel will start following God, and then after a while will want to do their own thing, and then they'll get into trouble, and then they'll get in problems, and then they'll call out to God, and God will rescue them, and they'll be so thankful that they'll start to follow God. And then pretty soon they'll decide, I'm going to go do my own thing, and then they'll get into trouble again, and they'll call out to God again, and God will come and rescue them again, and it just happens over and over. It's like, wash, rinse, repeat, over and over again. And one day the people, they went to Samuel, and they said, look, everybody around us, they all have kings. We want to have a king too. And so God picks his first king, a man named Saul. Saul looks like a king. He's tall, he's good looking, broad shoulders, walks straight. He just looks like a king. When you look at him and you say, which one is a king? That's the guy that looks like a king. And so Samuel goes to Saul and he says, you're going to be king. And Samuel invites all of Israel to come to a huge party for Saul, because Saul is about to be crowned king of Israel. But they can't find Saul anywhere. He was out hiding. You see, Saul was insecure. He was jealous. And his insecurity and his jealousy made him angry all the time. And Saul would do whatever he needed to do to protect his authority, to protect his power, and eventually it would destroy him. Several years after Paul was crowned king, his insecurity caused him to disobey God again. And God had had enough. And so he finally said, I'm going to take my spirit off of Saul and I'm going to place it on the next guy. And he placed it on a young man named David. And it was 15 years between the time that David was anointed king of Israel and the time that he actually became king of Israel. And what do we call the gap between somebody's raw gift and his gift in its fully developed form? What do we call that space in the middle? Potential. So today we're going to see what David has to teach us about finding and fulfilling our potential. So how do we find and fulfill our potential? First, we have to check your heart. You have to check your heart. Because if your heart's not right, you won't face your giant. If your heart's not in it, you won't want to face your giant. So before you do anything else, you have to do a heart check. When God decided that Saul wasn't going to be the guy anymore, he sent Samuel to go to this little town of Bethlehem to find a man named Jesse. And God said that one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king of Israel. So Samuel goes out, he goes to Jesse's house, and he says, okay, one of your sons is going to be the king of Israel. And so Jesse throws a big party, right? And he invites Saul in, and he takes his 7 sons one at a time. And the first son to come out is the oldest son. His oldest son was Eliab. And Eliab was tall, good looking. When you looked at Eliab, man, this guy looked like a king. He just looked the part. Like if you looked at all in the line and you saw this guy, that guy must be the king. And Samuel said, surely this must be the Lord's anointed. And God was like, hold on, Samuel. That's not the guy. This is what God said to Samuel. He says, but the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. In other words, he might look the part, but he doesn't have the heart. God was saying, no, it's not this guy. So they brought the second son, Abinadab. And God said, no, that's not the guy either. And one by one, Jesse brought out 7 sons. And all of them, the answer was no. And Samuel's like, that's it? That's all you got? Jesse says, well, there's the youngest son, but he's out watching the sheep. And Samuel says, get him, because no one is going to start eating until he gets here. Right? Big, huge party, food everywhere. No one can eat until David gets here. David was 15 years old when Saul anointed him to be the next king of Israel. 15. Now listen, age wasn't a factor. You can't be too young and you can't be too old. God wants all of us to join him in changing the world. But if you are going to fulfill your potential, it starts with your heart first. The second thing you have to do is you have to work passionately wherever you are. See, David was a shepherd. He was a shepherd boy, but he was a shepherd. He was a good shepherd. But that's not all he was. David was also an accomplished musician and songwriter. And so when Saul was still dealing with the negative effects of his jealousy and his insecurity, which is kind of leading him into a depression, one day, one of his advisors comes up to him and says, hey, king, listen, I know a guy. Right? He's a really good musician. So why don't we do this? Why don't I have him come over? He can play you some tunes. It'll help you chill out and relax. What do you think? And Saul's like, okay, go ahead. Tell him to come on over. So David came over and he played for Saul. And it must have helped because Saul would call David to come and play for him over the next several years. This is what scripture tells us. It says David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army because they were about to go into battle. And so the army had camped out on the edge of a mountain. But David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. So David was going back and forth from the little town of Bethlehem that he lived in, taking care of his sheep, and then going to the front line to play music for the king. One day, Jesse said to David, take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. And give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they are doing. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. See, David served Saul faithfully as a musician, and Saul kept him around for several years because David was a good musician. And he was also a hardworking musician. Because if David sucked at his music, like if I was the one who was playing, then, Saul would have said, no, get out of here, right? If David had sucked at his music, he wouldn't have lasted very long. But David worked hard and he took his natural ability and he worked at making it better and better. And then when he was done playing, he would go back to his father and he would switch from being a musician to being a shepherd again. And he would take care of his sheep. And then when David was called back to go to the king to play his music, David didn't just walk away from his responsibilities. He didn't just drop everything and go, I'm being called by the king, time for me to go. No, David made sure that his shift was covered. He made sure to be responsible for his responsibilities there. Here's what I want you to see in this. You don't have to be passionate about your work to work passionately. Because it's not so much about what you do, but it's about who you do it for. The Apostle Paul would write this in a letter to the church in Colossae. He would say, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for man. Don't work at it like you're working for that guy. Work at it as if you're working for the Lord because you are. You see, it's not about what you're doing. It's about who you're doing it for. And if you want to find and fulfill your potential, you have to be willing to work passionately at whatever it is you are doing. The third thing is you have to be willing to do what others won't. Now, this is where the David and Goliath story really begins. See, Goliath was a member of the Philistine army. And the Philistines were a nation, and the Israelites, they were at war with each other. And so one day, the Israelites are on one mountain, and the Philistines are on another mountain. And in the middle of them was the valley of Elah. And they met there across from each other, and everyone was afraid to go down into the valley. And then this happens. It says, then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. Now get this, he was over 9 feet tall. 9 feet tall, right? He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Now, this is one big dude. I mean, really big dude. And it says that Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight? He called. I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, get this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Now, Goliath just threw down a challenge. And whose job was it to accept the challenge? It was a king's job. And Saul fighting Goliath would have been a good fight because Saul was tall, he was strong, and he was battle tested. But scripture tells us that when Saul saw Goliath, he was terrified and deeply shaken. And when all the rest of the Israelites in the army saw Goliath, they were all terrified and deeply shaken too. Everyone except David. Listen to what David says. He says, don't worry about this Philistine. David told Saul, I'll go fight him. See, if you're going to fulfill your potential, you've got to be willing to do what others won't. You've got to be willing to do what other people won't do. The fourth thing is this. Don't let others tell you what you can't do. Listen, you probably experienced this, but whenever someone sets out to change the world, whenever you put in the hard work to fulfill your potential, you're inevitably going to make the people around you uncomfortable. People are going to make fun of you. People are going to tell you to slow down. They're going to tell you that you have to be realistic. And they're going to tell you that they're saying all of this for your own good, when in reality, oftentimes, they're saying it to make themselves feel better, to get them off the hook from having to do the hard work of fulfilling their potential. Listen to what Saul says to David. He says, don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can win this fight. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. He has been a man of war since his youth. David didn't listen to him, because if you're going to fulfill your potential, then just like David, you can't let others tell you what you can't do. Fifth thing is this. You have to realize that everything you've gone through has prepared you for where you are now. Everything you've gone through has prepared you for where you are now. Now, some of you need to listen to these next 3 words, because these next 3 words just might change your life. But David persisted. But David persisted. He didn't give up. He didn't slow down. He didn't step aside so that Saul would feel better. David persisted. He says, David persisted. And this is what David says. He says, I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. See, David is telling us something that we need to know. That everything that we have gone through before has brought us to this moment. Everything that you have gone through, good or bad, every experience that you've had, every mistake that you made, every good thing that has happened in your life has brought you to the moment that you are at now. And everything that you're going through right now is preparing you for the future. The last thing is this: be who God made you to be and stop trying to be who you're not. And I know this is a hard one, because with media today, we look at other people's lives and other people's accomplishments, and we easily think to ourselves, that's who I want to be. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to accomplish. Those are the things I want to have. But if we're going to find and fulfill our potential, we have to be who God made us to be, and stop trying to be who God didn't make us to be. Stop trying to be who God made someone else to be. Listen to this. It says, then Saul, because he had agreed, okay, David, you can go out. So then Saul gave David his armor. In other words, okay, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it my way. Right, so he gives him his armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then this part gets a little weird, right? Then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath tumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. See, David chose to be who God created him to be. He didn't settle for who Saul thought he should be. Instead, he worked to find and fulfill his potential, and because of that, God gave him the victory. And listen, you can do that too. You can find and fulfill your potential, and you can get the victory just like David did. You just need to get started. Can you imagine what would happen if everyone who is in this room today, every one of you who are watching us online, regardless of when you are watching us, but if everyone who is hearing this today would make the commitment to find and fulfill their potential? Can you imagine what would happen? Can you imagine the people that would benefit from that? How many people who are struggling in our city to make ends meet would be helped? How many people who are struggling in our neighborhoods with addictions could be helped? How many broken families could be put back together? How many marriages could be strengthened? How many relationships between parents and children could be transformed? How many schools would change? How many businesses could change if we all made the commitment? If you and I made the commitment, what would happen in your own life if you just made the commitment to stop and check your heart, to make sure that your heart is in the right place? If you made the commitment to work passionately wherever you are, even if you're not passionate about where you're working, but work passionately wherever you are. What if you made the commitment to be willing to do what others aren't doing? To step into those places where no one wants to go, and to not let others tell you what you can't do? What would happen in your life if you made the commitment to always recognize that everything that you've gone through in the past has prepared you for what you're going through right now? What would happen in your life if you made the commitment to be who God created you to be, instead of trying to be someone you're not? It has the potential to transform our neighborhoods. It has the potential to transform our nation. It has the potential to transform your life and your world.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.